Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will continue our series on biblical women. This time, Rebekah takes the stage. She first appears in Genesis 24, which narrates the story in which Abraham arranges for his servant to procure a wife for Isaac, the child Sarah born to him. Abraham wanted to ensure that Isaac's wife would come from his extended family, who was still residing in Mesopotamia. That's in verse 4 of chapter 24. When the servant finally got to his destination, he stopped at a spring. That's in 24 verse 13. Naturally, a spring is a popular place. People, mostly women, need to go to a spring every day for water to get through the day. Upon seeing young women approaching the spring to draw water, Abraham's servant said a little prayer, which was geared to help him determine whether a wife for Isaac might be among the group. The servant thought that if a young woman not only offered him a drink and offered to water his camels too, that would be a sign that Isaac's wife had been found. That's in verse 14, chapter 24. Sure enough, Rebekah did just that. She graciously acceded to the servant's request for a drink and also offered to water the animals. Rebekah passed the test. Of course, she was perfect as a candidate for Isaac. She was beautiful and a virgin. Even better, she just happened to be Abraham's niece, for her father was Abraham's brother. Knowing that he had hit paydirt, the servant gave Rebekah a ring and a bracelet. Then he asked whether there was room in her father's house so that he could stay a spell. Of course, Rebekah could not have been more hospitable. She pointed out not only that there was room, but even provisions for the animals. That's in verses 22 to 27 of chapter 24. Rebekah ran home to tell her mother's household what had happened. Her brother, Laban, took one look at her new jewelry and immediately extended an invitation to the man who was her benefactor. Laban saw to it that the animals were cared for, made sure that the man's feet as well as those of the man's servants were washed, and prepared food for the guests. That's in verse 32. However, before Abraham's servant took a bite, he wanted the family to know about the reason for his visit. The servant noted how God had blessed Abraham, his master. He was enormously wealthy. Plus, in his old age, his wife Sarah bore him a son. That son was now grown and needed a wife. Abraham wanted to make sure that Isaac's wife came from the extended family rather than the Canaanites, in whose land he was currently dwelling. Also, the man said, I said a little prayer when Rebekah came to the spring. I believed that a woman who offered water to both me and my animals would be the person whom I had been seeking. When Rebekah acted accordingly, I knew that God was behind this. This is in verses 42 through 48. Having told this story, the servant wanted to know what Rebekah's family thought. That's in verse 49. The family agreed that Rebekah's actions had been providential, and therefore gave permission for Rebekah to return with the servant to become Isaac's wife. That's in verses 50 to 51. Receiving this news, Abraham's servant acknowledged that providence had been served, and proceeded to lavish the family with more gifts. Rebekah not only received more presents, but her mother and brother got gifts as well. Then they had a party. That's in verses 52 and 53. The next morning, the servant asked permission to leave and, of course, take Rebekah with him. Suddenly, Rebekah's mother and brother demurred, instead suggesting that the would-be bride stay home for another week and a half. The reason for this delay is not specified, but it's hard to avoid the impression that the family may have thought that more gifts might be in the offing. However, at the servant's urging, Rebekah's mother and brother agreed to ask her opinion about whether she was ready to leave. Without hesitation, Rebekah proclaimed herself ready to go to be with Isaac. After a familial blessing, Rebekah left her home and traveled to Isaac's. When she got there, she became Isaac's wife. That's in verses 58 through 67 of chapter 24. Unfortunately, Rebekah had a difficult time conceiving. Indeed, we are told that she was barren. In response, Isaac prayed. The prayer was successful. Rebekah was soon pregnant. But she was having a difficult pregnancy because she was carrying twins who were struggling in her womb. She was so distraught that she wondered why she was still alive. At that point, the Lord appeared to her. During this theophany, the Lord told her that her two boys would eventually represent two nations, one of which would end up being stronger. It would turn out that the elder son would serve the younger. No other descriptions are offered. Plus, the Lord said nothing about what Rebekah should do to make this circumstance a reality. That's in verses 21 through 23. When Rebekah gave birth to twin boys, they were described in cryptic terms. The first child emerged covered with red hair. No description is offered for the second child. Instead, we are told that he grabbed hold of his brother's heel at birth. Isaac was 60 when this took place. When the boys were grown, the older one, named Esau, became an expert hunter. Jacob, on the other hand, was simply described as Tam, a Hebrew word suggesting being a moral exemplar. This child was named Jacob, a word suggesting his having grabbed hold of his brother's heel. Though Esau was a man of the field, we learn that Jacob stayed home and lived in tents. Isaac was partial to Esau because he liked the game he hunted and cooked. Rebekah, however, was partial to Jacob. No reasons are given for her preference. Was it because this son was around? Or was it because she wanted to balance out the family dynamics? Or was it because of the revelation she had been given by God? Or some combination of these reasons? We can only speculate. That's in verses 27 through 28 of chapter 25. In any case, time passes by until Isaac has gotten so old that he thinks it is time to pass on a blessing to his son. This blessing has to do with the son's future. As was the custom, the future of the family is in the hands of the elder son, namely Esau. So, Isaac summons Esau, tells him that his death is probably sooner rather than later, and tells Esau to hunt and prepare a favorite dish, which the two of them will eat in a ceremony which is dedicated to the pending blessing. That's in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 27 of Genesis. Of course, years before, Esau had signed away his birthright to Jacob. That story is told in chapter 25, verses 27 through 34. We have no way of knowing which brother would win in a contest in which one has a birthright and the other has a blessing. But it is fair to surmise that at least that would be a basis for negotiation. Should one son have both birthright and blessing, surely that would be a great advantage. Regardless, Esau went to hunt, anticipating that his father would soon bless him, thus ensuring a fine future. But it turns out that Rebekah had overheard Isaac when he gave these instructions to Esau. Once she knew what Isaac was planning to do, she sprung into action. She apparently had no qualms about deceiving her husband or betraying her older son, for she put into motion plans that would elevate Jacob and diminish Esau. We have no way of knowing whether she did this for her partiality toward Jacob or the revelation she had from God, or both. What we do know is what she did to orchestrate events. She immediately called Jacob, told him what she had heard Isaac say, and gave him orders. Jacob was to go immediately to the flock, procure an animal, which she would make in a manner that imitated the savory dish that Esau used to make for his father. The reason for this ruse was clear. Isaac would bless Jacob instead of Esau. Jacob was instantly worried about being found out and getting cursed instead of being blessed. But Rebekah had anticipated Jacob's reaction. She had already concocted a plot that would deceive Isaac. Due to his age, Isaac no longer had good eyesight. That's in verse 1 of chapter 27. This meant that he would not recognize the son standing in front of him. However, Jacob pointed out that Esau was hirsute. Remember that he was covered with hair from birth. Jacob, on the other hand, was a smooth man. Should Isaac embrace his son, he would immediately be able to distinguish a smooth Jacob from a hairy Esau. Rebekah, however, had that problem covered. She would use the pelt from the animal she would cook to cover Jacob's neck and arms, thereby disguising Jacob. Also, since she knew what spices Esau used when he cooked for his father, Rebekah could fool Isaac into thinking that Esau had himself prepared the dish. Isaac did not see well, his tactile senses could be fooled with the animal's pelt, and his sense of taste could likewise be fooled. Only his hearing presented a problem. That difficulty would be handled by Jacob's ability to lie convincingly, which he did. The trick worked. As expected, Isaac's eyes failed him so that he did not recognize Jacob in disguise. When his suspicion was aroused, he felt the pelt when he embraced Jacob, thereby thinking the lad he was hugging was Esau. Isaac, however, did recognize Jacob's voice, but dismissed the idea that he was speaking to the younger rather than the older son. Somehow his other senses trumped his accurate sense of hearing. And, of course, Rebekah's expertise at spicing the food so that it tasted like what Esau would have prepared sealed the deal. When all was said and done, Rebekah had indeed completely deceived her husband and betrayed her older son. Again, we do not know whether she did this to promote her favorite son or because of the divine revelation, or both. A couple of comments are in order. Though Rebekah's ethics in this episode are suspect, she clearly comes off as wily, clever, and intelligent. Regardless of her motivation, she thought her actions were necessary to ensure that her husband would bless the younger son. Of course, this accorded with the divine prophecy. This is not the first time, though, that the divine will is accomplished through dubious ethical actions. Keep in mind that Jacob had already exploited his brother's appetite when he got him to agree to give up his birthright. Rebekah's actions are to be seen in the same light. Though the culture that produced this story was patriarchal to the core, that did not stop its author from presenting Rebekah as just as clever, intelligent, and scheming as any man could ever hope to be. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. If you would like me to answer a question in a subsequent Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.